Hello, MACC members. Welcome to MACC's recurring series, Powerful Voices Lasting Impact, for this year's Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, or AAPI Heritage Month. My name is Mya Corbin, MACC's Communications Specialist, and I'll be speaking with the Asian professionals in our network all May. We'll discuss topics such as honoring cultural and community values, equity and resistance, and historic patterns in immigrant and refugee communities and how to better support them. MACC is committed to ongoing learning as we work collectively to disrupt oppressive systems and address systemic racism and the ways they impact our member organizations, our human services sector, and our communities. MACC believes that everyone has the right to well-being, and that's why it's so important that we hear from everyone in our network. Please continue to tune in to Powerful Voices Lasting Impact for this AAPI Heritage Month with more Asian professionals in the Minnesota nonprofit workforce. Today, I'm joined by Jennifer So, the Director of Community-Based Evaluation and Impact from Neighborhood House. Today, we'll discuss the topic of historical oppression in emerging immigrant and refugee communities and sector support strategies. Welcome, Jennifer. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Maya. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for this one. So, just before we jump in, could you briefly share your experience being an Asian woman in the nonprofit sector?
Sure. So I started in nonprofit sector back in 2011. I am originally from New York City, so most of my work with nonprofits have been with immigrant communities throughout New York City and state. And I moved to Minnesota 4 months ago to start this new exciting job at Neighborhood House in St. Paul.
Awesome, awesome. New York is a big city to go from to come to Minnesota.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah,
It's
that's
been quite a change, but it's been wonderful so far.
Yeah, that's a big jump. That's so interesting. So, we're jumping into this idea about historical patterns. And just to start things off for you, how do you think we're seeing historical patterns of oppression be replicated in some of our newer and smaller immigrant or refugee communities? And are there any ways our sector could support these communities better, in your opinion?
Sure. So I think it's important for us to first start with how we think about Asian American in Minnesota. And I'm very much still learning. I've been here again for 4 months. So every day is a new learning experience. But I think in general, there's been this long pervasive sort of pattern of Asian Americans being treated as a monolith. But when you look at the communities in Minnesota, I mean, first of all, there's this long established refugee communities are Hmong, Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodian communities. And then we also see newer refugee communities and Karen and Bhutanese communities. The Karen people, for example, I think they are the largest recent Southeast Asian population that arrived in early 2000s as political refugees. Um, but then we also know that data may be sort of combined with other ethnic groups. And then we also have an Asian American, our adoptee community. Like, for example, Minnesota is the largest concentration of Korean adoptees. And we also have a large number of mixed status families here in the state. And I think what can happen is that newer and smaller communities can often become institutionally invisible because, for example, funding systems with nonprofits tend to, I think, reward organizations that already have established infrastructure, visibility, and relationship with funders. But what happens with some of our smaller organizations that are doing deeply trusted work in the communities with communities is that they're oftentimes under resourced with very little institutional support. They might not necessarily have that kind of like robust long-term relationship with some of the bigger funders. So I think that's one way we see that, you know, some of the newer smaller communities may be overseen, and also in other ways, particularly from where I sit in my data and impact work, there is a need for more disaggregated data because oftentimes when it comes to Asian American communities is like, for example, I think in Minnesota, Asian households have the highest average median income, which is around, I think, 67,000, according to a report that was published by CAL, Coalition of Asian American Leaders. But then when you look at the disaggregated data, Asian Indians are at an average of about $96,000 of median income, whereas the Burmese are at about $26,000 of average median income. So that shows us that there is this a very wide range in how we might not be really looking at and understanding what's really happening in Asian American communities. So I think that's also something else to consider.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this idea of being institutionally invisible. A lot of orgs are oftentimes, under-resourced in these communities, so I'm glad you brought up that point. In your opinion, how are we seeing historical patterns of oppression, exclusion, and disenfranchisement being replicated in our Asian communities in Minnesota? Like, what are you seeing in clients in the communities that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically there's been this pattern of exclusion and disenfranchisement in the way that Asian Americans have been often sought out for, economic development and labor, but they've been excluded politically and socially. So the ways in which we see that manifest are one, there's like lack of disaggregated data, like what I mentioned. There is severe gap in language access. There's exclusion from broader, I think, racial and ethnic equity conversations across the board. So specifically in the clients and the communities that Neighborhood House works with, I feel very strongly about language access, that oftentimes we see services and signage in different spaces only offered in English. Then in turn, I think that creates a sense of exclusion, whether intended or not. And oftentimes it's not intended, but the impact is, while folks may come for different services and programs, that there's a layer of welcoming inclusion that's missing because there's no language available. I think there's also this sense of conditional belonging, that there's this sense of acceptance only if Asian Americans are behaving in a certain way, such as being, quiet, productive, or economically useful. But what we have seen in history is that when there's tension in terms of, economic, social, and political spheres, then these communities are oftentimes scapegoated. We have seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are tons of examples throughout history. So then I think that also potentially results in not long-term sustainable systemic changes, but really short-term reactions or responses that kind of leave these communities hanging once those tensions or crises have been addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you also brought up Asians being excluded from political conversations and the importance of having language present. That's how we communicate. We need
Hmm.
to be able to, understand one another, and being able to have things like that in place for equity and accessibility is really important as well. So just excellent words there. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I know it goes super fast when we're chatting about these things, but I'm so glad that you're able to share some of that insight. Be sure to listen in on the series so you don't miss any of our insightful Asian leaders and professionals in our sector. All of these short podcasts will be available on our social media, Podbean, and our website, so please stay tuned. Do something that makes you feel joy today, and happy AAPI Heritage Month. See you all.